us. So
Sure.
thank you.
Okay. Great. Okay. All right. So I apologize for those difficulties, but thank you again for joining us. My name is Robert Nathanson. I'm a senior researcher here at the American Institutes for Research. And what we'd like to do today is we wanted to share internally the results from the work we've been doing with Fisk-Vanderbilt on their bridge program. So these are the Fisk-Vanderbilt study research findings. We're talking about the rationale, methods, findings, and next steps. And I'd like to thank my colleagues, in particular, Evan Witherspoon, Courtney Tannenbaum, who's the principal investigator on the project, Chris Peak, Mark Hatcher, Abby Jeffries, Karantama Kaleem. And we also really want to thank our colleagues over at Fisk-Vanderbilt. That's Dina Stroud, as well as Lauren Campbell and Rihanna Roby, Dr. Roby. And none of this would be possible without a strong partnership with them. So today what we want to do is we want to talk to you about the overview of the Fisk-Vanderbilt's Master's to Bridge program, the evaluation we've been doing. We're going to present some key findings, and that includes qualitative work as well as quantitative work. And then we're going to open up to discussion and questions. So feel free to interject if you have questions or put your questions in the chat, or we can also discuss them at the end. This program is a long-standing program. It's one of the oldest programs in the country. It was founded in 2004, and its goal is to expand access to STEM graduate education in the United States, to cultivate an untapped pool of students and improve the persistence and outcomes in STEM graduate programs for these students. So in particular, the Fisk-Vanderbilt Bridge program really tries to identify individuals that might not necessarily have the same undergraduate opportunities to pursue STEM careers, identify them and admit them into the program and foster a whole system of supports to facilitate as they're in these graduate programs. It's focused specifically on some STEM fields: biology, physics, chemistry, astronomy. And so that's one of the main goals. And the other one is to look at, for our evaluation, how high-touch proactive mentoring and community building can influence these student experiences, their preparation for transitions and success into the STEM graduate program. So we're going to be looking at this both quantitatively and qualitatively. We have a lot of data, and to say this briefly, we have information on students that were admitted and information on those that were enrolled. We integrate some public data sets. There was a survey that was conducted and social network analysis. Evan Witherspoon will be speaking about that. And we also did a lot of qualitative work. And I don't want you to focus on the details of this table. This just outlines all the different interviews that we did. The main number is that one on the bottom right in red. It's 45. We talked to 45 different individuals, whether they were students or faculty or alumni or administrators in the program, to really get a good sense of how the program is operating. Okay. And so with that, what I'd like to do is pass this over to my colleague, Abby Jeffries, who's going to be talking about examining program reach and success and expanding access. Thanks, Abby.
Thanks, Robert. That was a great introduction. First of all, apologies for my voice today. I'm coming off of a bit of a sinus cold, so apologies. But yeah, thank you, Robert, for that great introduction. And thank you all for taking the time to join us today to learn a little bit about the research that we've been doing. So for this section, we're really going to be looking at the institutional characteristics of both applicants to the Bridge program and students who are actually enrolled in the Bridge program, and what that means for the program's reach and success in diversifying the STEM pipeline. So this section is really grounded in these two questions. So we wanted to understand, how do the institutional level characteristics differ and compare between applicants and enrolled students? And then what are the student level characteristics of actually enrolled students, and how do they compare to enrolled STEM master students nationally? And before we really dig into the data, I just want to mention, although Robert gave a little bit of a preview to it, when we're talking about the student applicants and enrolled students, we're talking about two different sources of data. The applicant data was collected over a much longer period of time, from 2004 when the program started until about 2020. And then the enrolled data is from 2018 to 2020. So just want to let y'all know, keep that in mind as we're looking. It's not necessarily an apples to apples comparison. So in this case, or for this slide, I want to quickly give a shout out to my colleague, Evan Witherspoon, for creating this great visual. Here we're looking at, we're comparing the location of undergraduate institutions of applicants and enrolled students at the Bridge program. And here we can see that while the Bridge program attracts and enrolls a number of students from the area and surrounding area where the Bridge is located, which is in Tennessee, the Bridge program is still attracting and enrolling students from a wide variety of states and regions in the United States, and even in the outlying areas like Hawaii, even though it's hard to see, there is a dot down there, Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands. And while they are achieving this great, breadth of reach with applicants and enrolled students, there is still opportunity to grow in reaching students that are located in areas like the Upper New England area, the Plains and Rocky Mountains regions. On this slide, we're comparing the institutional type of applicants and enrolled students. So whether the undergraduate institutions they're coming from are minority serving institutions or predominantly white institutions. Here we can see that most applicants and enrolled students are coming from predominantly white institutions. However, the Bridge program is attracting and enrolling students from HBCUs and Hispanic serving institutions that are higher, and sometimes much higher than the national percentage of these types of institutions in the United States. So when we look at this little blurb on the right, it says that the Bridge program is enrolling students from HBCUs at a rate that's 10 times that of the national percentage of HBCUs. So that means although there's just 3%, or although HBCUs make up just 3% of institutions in the United States, the Bridge program is still is attracting and enrolling students at very high rates from those institutions. And the same goes for Hispanic serving institutions, although the Bridge program is attracting and enrolling students at rates that are pretty comparable to the national percentage of Hispanic serving institutions, which is about 17% of institutions of higher education in the United States. And this slide just depicts, breaks down kind of the additional undergraduate institutional characteristics that we looked at in comparing the two groups of students. So the red ovals here just indicate under each variable what's the largest percent. And so we can see that most applicants and enrolled students are coming from public institutions that serve 1,000 to 5,000 or 20,000 or more students that are also doctoral or professional universities. Okay, so now we're kind of shifting our focus, looking specifically within enrolled students. So here, apologies if this is a little small, but we're comparing the composition, the racial and ethnic composition of the bridge program to the national composition of enrolled STEM master's students. So here we can see the lighter blue is the national percent, and then the darker blue is the bridge students. So we can see that the bridge program is really challenging or really shifting the national narrative when, excuse me, they're enrolling a majority of students of color compared to white students. And we think this really speaks to the reach in or the program's commitment efforts to diversify the STEM pipeline. And we see a similar pattern when it comes to gender. So again, the lighter blue is the national percentage and the darker blue is the bridge students. So here we can see that the bridge program is actually enrolling students who identify as female and male at rates that reflect the opposite of the national percentage of science and engineering master's enrollees. So again, shifting that national narrative for who is making up our STEM students. And with that, I will turn it back over to you, Robert. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Abby. So with that, we wanted to first show you about the applicants and the enrollees, and then now what we want to do is show you how the students are doing once they're enrolled in the program, or examining program success and achieving goals and objectives. And so we had a few research questions. Are the patterns to how students are selected to interview? Are there patterns how they're selected to interview for the Fisk-Vanderbilt Bridge program? What are the trajectories that the students take once they're enrolled? And how do the rates of them earning degrees at the Fisk-Vanderbilt Bridge program compare to similar students nationally, as well as a comparison we did for other Tennessee students? And so what we wanted to do first and foremost is show that we find that there's no evidence of selectivity bias. There's no difference in the applicants being interviewed on institutional characteristics. So the region, the size, the Carnegie classification, we think this is really important because it's indicative of the fact that the Fisk-Vanderbilt Bridge program is very thoughtful about who they are interviewing for the slots of these programs, and there are very few slots. And it's not the case, we find, that they're drawing on who to interview based off of a proxy of the quality of the undergraduate institution, the region, the size, the name. There's nothing going on there. And so they're not evaluating based off of someone's looking on the institution, how it looks on paper. Moreover, there's no difference on GPA for students being granted an interview. So the average of those that aren't interviewed is about 3.1, and the average of those that is interviewed is just about 3.2, just shy. There's no statistically significant or substantive difference in the undergraduate GPA of students that are granted an interview versus not for the Fisk-Vanderbilt Bridge program. And we think this is really critical because there's no difference on GPA, there's no difference on race, ethnicity, there's no difference on sex. They're also not selecting who gets admitted to this program or who gets an interview. Then you're interviewed, and then if you're successful, then you're admitted by any of these individual characteristics. That means that they're not looking at someone's traditional metric of GPA on their resume or their CV and saying, this is a higher GPA, we want them in the program. So there's no evidence of cream skimming. In other words, they're not picking just the best students that look on paper on these traditional metrics. Instead, they're doing a good job finding students that qualify under other metrics that are not traditionally looked for. And so the Fisk-Vanderbilt program make a really strong emphasis on this fact of not trying to select individuals because they look good on traditional metrics. And we find precisely that's the case, both on these individual characteristics and these institutional characteristics of their undergraduate institutions. Okay, So now that we see that, they're doing a really good job admitting students with potentially non-traditional backgrounds or don't necessarily look better according to these traditional metrics. The question is, how do they do? And so also I'd like to thank Evan Witherspoon, who did a really great job putting this graphic together. And here, what we're trying to showcase is the longitudinal trajectories of these students once they're enrolled in STEM programs. And so Y0 represents year 0 of the year they entered the Fisk-Vanderbilt Bridge Program Master's Program. So it doesn't matter your year of start, which cohort you are, year 0 is when you started. And you can see there's about 150 of them, and almost all of them move from year 1, year 0, through finishing that first year onto year 2, which is the beginning of that is Y1, and you can see their trajectories. And so what's really important is almost all of these students go on and earn a master's degree, and we have numbers on that in a couple slides. The national median of time to earning a master's degree in STEM fields is 3.1 years. And in Fisk-Vanderbilt, it's 2, a little bit over 2. There are a couple students that take a little bit longer. So they're finishing faster. So not only most of them are finishing faster than the national average. And so we have in green those that are earning the MA at the second year, and that's happens faster than the national average. And then if you look at the numbers up at the top, you've got those darker yellow boxes. Those are individuals that are going into PhD programs, and they're going into PhD programs at really sizable numbers. I have those numbers again in a few slides. But what you can see is that there's students who are moving into the PhD at good numbers, and those yellow boxes and those dark green ones up at the top, they're earning their PhD, and they're also earning that PhD or their doctoral degree faster than the national average, which is a little bit over 9 years. And so we think this is indicative of the fact that the Fisk-Vanderbilt Bridge program is being very thoughtful about who they admit to try to expand and diversify the pipeline. And then they provide a whole system of supports when individuals are on campus, which have been widely successful in getting these students to persist in their programs, to earn their masters, to do it faster than the national average, to apply to PhDs and enroll and persist in PhDs at very high rates, and to also earn those faster than the national average. Okay. So the students are more likely to earn their masters and their PhD. This is compared to the national STEM figures. About 89% in the Fisk and Vanderbilt program earning their masters. It's about 60% nationwide. For earning the PhD of those that enrolled, it's 72% at Fisk and Vanderbilt, and that's conditional also having been in the program long enough to have completed your coursework, not someone who just entered their PhD last year. And the national average is 59%, so again, much higher. Of those who finish the master's degree at Fisk and Vanderbilt, 82% go on to apply for a PhD program. And of those 82, 94% of them enter a PhD program. So really quite high numbers. And this holds when we look at standard individual characteristics or demographic characteristics. It's particularly high for both men and women. There's almost no difference, a 2 percentage point. I wouldn't interpret that in any way between the men and women at Fisk and Vanderbilt. The broader point is it's widely outpacing the national average. And same with earning the PhD. At Fisk and Vanderbilt, actually, there's no gender gap. And if they're, and women are actually outperforming the men by a slight percent, with 73% earning the PhD versus men, where it's 71%. And so we think this is also indicative of the fact that there's often a gender gap in STEM performance, and there's no evidence of this whatsoever in the Fisk-Vanderbilt Bridge program. When we look at this by race and ethnicity, African American, Latinx, we see that they're also generally widely outperforming the national averages, with African Americans, for instance, 82% earning the master's degree, whereas it's about half nationally. Same with Hispanic, 90% versus about half nationally. When it comes to earning the PhD, African Americans are doing outperforming by 25% greater for earning the PhD, and for Hispanics, it's about the same as the national averages. And so we think that when you look at the overall numbers, when you look at them by sex, you look at them by race, ethnicity, the Fisk-Vanderbilt program is doing a particularly good job fostering these students once they get to campus so that they can earn their master's, continue in their STEM journey, go on to those PhDs and be successful there as well. So those were the national numbers. And so my final slide before I pass this off to Evan is to talk about, we did a propensity score matching in Tennessee. We were able to get access to the Tennessee longitudinal data system to be able to look at other students in Tennessee, the same cohort, so across the same time period in the same fields of study, and what other students in these master STEM fields in Tennessee were doing compared to Fisk and Vanderbilt. And so we did a propensity score matching to be able to more accurately align some of the Fisk-Vanderbilt students to these other Tennessee students, and we matched on demographics, undergraduate institution, the major, and descriptively about 80% of this match sample in Fisk-Vanderbilt, it's smaller than the overall sample due to the matching, about 80% earned the master's degree, whereas about 32% in these other Tennessee institutions. And so if you do the descriptive odds ratio, the odds that the students in the Fisk-Vanderbilt Bridge program earn their master's degree were nearly 10 times that of similar students earning their STEM masters in Tennessee. So we also think this is indicative of the wild success of the Fisk-Vanderbilt program of bringing these students successfully to campus and successfully supporting them once they are on campus. And so with that, those are our quantitative findings. And so we conducted a number of other pieces of work. We did a social network analysis and a lot of qualitative interviews. And the remainder of our time today, we'd like to spend discussing those aspects to get a more full picture of the different supports and systems that are in place for these students. And so with that, Evan, I will hand it to you.
Great. Thank you, Robert. Just brief note that my 5-month-old is in the background. So I guess since we're recording this, if you hear her, this will be her first presentation. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about a social network analysis survey that we conducted sort of after looking through the qualitative information and seeing that we thought that the networks that students were forming were really important in some of these outcomes. And as Robert said, I think that these results we just saw are helpful in showing what happened in terms of outcomes, but other methods like social network analysis and especially the qualitative work can talk about the why, right? Dig into some of the mechanisms through which the program achieves these outcomes. So our research questions for the social network analysis was first just what do these support networks look like? So for students, who are the people that they go to for support during the program? Who do they go to support? Also, how often do they go to them? Do they just go once a semester, once a year, or do they go more frequently? And then what types of support? So we also asked questions of the students of whether they go to these people for social emotional support, more academic support, more logistical support, or career-based support. And those categories were developed through ongoing conversations with our client. And the second question is, how are these networks related to sense of belonging? And again, in conversation with the Fisk-Vanderbilt team, we decided that sense of belonging was in the literature and in their understanding of the program and through the qualitative work, an important predictor, we think, of students' persistence and engagement in the program. So just a brief reminder about SNA, for those of you who aren't familiar with this, it's a new method to me as well, but this is what's called a sociogram. It's just a depiction of the network where each dot or circle is a node, a particular actor in the network. The links between these nodes are connections between two actors or called ties. And then Robert, you can advance the thickness of these ties is what we used as the frequency. So the number of times that they went to see one of these sources of support is depicted here as the thickness of these ties. And in this case, I did want to note that unlike some social networks, we had to, for various reasons, use a bipartite network here. First is that students' names weren't listed, so students cannot choose each other as sources of support. And also, the sources that they chose were categories of support, like my faculty advisor, et cetera, and not specific people. So that we can't draw conclusions about like whether students went to a common person, except in some cases where that source of support was a single person, like the executive director of the Bridge program. So I don't expect you to look at too closely at this massive of sociogram on the left, just to show that with relatively few respondents, because each respondent is answering about multiple types of support, you can get a lot of data from a relatively small sample. So we had about 63 students respond to this survey. Again, this survey asking them, who do they go to for support, how frequently, and what types of support. And what we can see here is that there's quite a variation in the type, number, and frequency of connections that students report. For example, just pulling out one student here, they had 2 people that they went to, looks like a research faculty and a course instructor, and they went to them pretty infrequently versus another student, student B, Robert, if you advance, went to a broader range of people for support, and those lines are a little bit thicker, meaning that they went to them more frequently. So you can see there's a lot of variation in the networks that these students are forming during the Bridge program. So if we start to group these, we can see some characteristics that differentiate between the types of networks for students based along some variables of interest, like do they continue on to earn their master's degree? What we can see here is that during the master's program, students who go on to earn their master's showed a greater breadth of support. So the yellow lines there are students that went on to earn their master's. The blue lines are students who did not earn their master's. And we see that students who earned their master's sought out a wider variety of types of supports. Everybody in the master's program went to some people like the Bridge coordinator, the Bridge executive director, but only those who went on to earn their master's sought out these other types of support, like the Greek life member, some of them went to their K-12 teachers and some other campus organizations. So it seems like this breadth of support is an important factor. And then we also asked students to reflect on those students who had finished. So all students in this sample had finished the master's program. We asked them, who do they continue to reach out to for support? And we see that students who have earned their master's and continue on are more likely to continue on seeking out some of these sources of support, particularly Bridge program sources of support. So Robert, if you advance, you can see that during the Bridge program, both students who earn and don't earn the master's reach out to the Bridge cohort, the Bridge co-director for support, but only those who continue on to earn the master's continue to reach out to those, specifically those Bridge program staff for support. And while of course, to some extent that makes sense, right? Those who have continued on to master's are going to continue on seeking out those supports. I think it's particularly important that those students that we do see going on to earn the master's, also 94% of them go on to earn their PhD. So we think this continuity of support of these Bridge program staff it may be particularly important for that. There's a lot of information on this slide, so I'm just going to pull out a few things, but this is essentially within Bridge program sources of support. This is the number of types of support that students selected. And you can see a lot of these make sense. The program coordinator, most students selected, that person helped them with administration and logistics support. Most of them selected that their cohort members and other Bridge students were helpful as social emotional supports. But there are other sources here that we see have a more broad range of the types of supports that they offer, particularly the executive director here. It's pretty evenly split across the social emotional support, academic support, career planning, and logistics support. So some people are providing lots of different types of support. So we wanted to pull that out and also show that particularly Bridge program sources like the cohort and staff on average provide more different types of support than non-Bridge program sources of support. And finally, in this last question, which really I think leads well into the qualitative reports of how these networks were important for students' sense of belonging in the program and sense of community. We correlated the different types of support the students reported with their reported sense of belonging. So these are correlation coefficients here. What we see is that All of these sources of support were correlated with students' reported sense of belonging. Less so administrative support, actually wasn't significant for administrative support, and most for social emotional support. So we see is that particularly social emotional support, also career and academic support, choosing those particular sources as the type of support that you're receiving. And we saw that Bridge program members, staff, and students are providing particularly some of those sources of support and multiple sources of support. We think that those are particularly important for the development of a sense of belonging amongst students, which we think, and as shown in the literature, is a key motivational component that's related to persistence to these programs. So we're going to dig into more of that with the qualitative work. My colleagues Mark and Chris will talk about next.
Great. Thank you so much, Evan. And again, if there are questions, feel free to interject or put them in the chat. We'll also have time at the end to discuss. So with that, I'd like to hand this over to my colleagues, both Mark Hatcher and Chris Peck, who will be talking about our qualitative results, examining influence of high-touch proactive mentoring and community building on the Fisk-Vanderbilt Bridge program, student experiences, transitions, and outcomes. Mark, with further ado, I'll hand it over to you. Thanks so much.
Excellent. Thank you, Robert. So we've already taken a look at some of the quantitative data and have dug into some of the findings from the SNA, but we got a lot of really rich and informative data from our qualitative work, right? We conducted a fair amount of focus groups and interviews. And so for this presentation, we're really going to dive into a couple sets of research questions. The first one really centers around mentorship, particularly what did it look like within the Bridge program, and then how did mentorship complement the Bridge program's efforts to build a sense of community. And then we're also going to take a look at how academic supports and activities were perceived as critical to both a student's preparation and transition into their STEM PhD program, and moving beyond their program into a post-STEM PhD career. And we'll also take a look at some perceived challenges or gaps throughout those transitions as well. So digging into to mentorship as it pertains to student success, we find mentors kind of served in 6 capacities that we grouped into 3 categories, if you will. Right. So first is serving as members of student support systems. And so we found that mentors really fostered a sense of belonging, and we'll circle back to that a little later, as well as, of course, bolstering existing student support systems, bolstering existing support systems, I should say. As Evan referenced, a lot of the students who went on to be successful bringing a lot of different sources of support, but mentors augmented that, if you will. Mentors also help students to navigate challenges and opportunities by acting as an advocate or a champion, if you will, for students, as well as helping them by providing guidance and assistance, kind of, advice and like the tradition, like advising in that sense of the term, and then helping to facilitate personal and professional growth, whether it's through helping students locate resources or opportunities, such as externships, presenting at conferences, so on and so forth. And then this just general kind of academic and professional growth. We see here on the right, by the way, I should say that the next few slides will have quotes that we feel highlight a particular aspect of a finding. And so in this slide, we see a master's student is really talking about the accessibility that they had from their mentor, how that really spoke out to them when this moment where they needed to think through effectively an elevator pitch of their work. They were able to connect with their mentor, and really led to them being able to take advantage of some opportunities. So when we look at the nature of mentoring relationships, we see that there's kind of some mutual aspects, if you will, between both mentor and mentee. And those are trust, communication, and established expectations. And if we look kind of to the quote here, another master's student echoed that sentiment right? Like having open conversation with student and mentor about expectations for students and expectation for mentor would be really helpful, right? So we see kind of establishing that doing some level setting, if you will, from the beginning is really important to building those relationships. We also see, particularly from the mentor perspective, that these are informed by varying frameworks. You know, we spoke to a couple mentors within the Bridge program who referenced a CARES model as shaping how they approach the relationship with their mentees. In addition, the Bridge program actually trained some of their faculty in some of these frameworks as well. So we see it's not that they're being prepared and bringing different tools, if you will, a toolbox, if you will, to building mentoring relationships. And then, of course, we see that the Bridge program is actively facilitated. Sorry, the Bridge program actively facilitates these relationships, right? And so they had various activities such as mentor mixers, where they would just bring a bunch of students and faculty and other folks affiliated with the Bridge program to allow them to kind of see what potential relationships could emerge from those spaces. And then looking at the role of mentorship when it comes to cultivating a strong sense of community, we see that mentors are essential in this process. One, because the Bridge program has designed it as such, right? Mentorship, even from the introductory language on our website, mentions the role of mentors frequently. And so we see that the mentors reinforce the value of community and actively foster a sense of community for the mentees. However, it's important to note that students who lack a strong mentor relationship can still feel a sense of community, right? And so the quote on the right here we have really encapsulates that. But I like to think of it as something akin to like hiking equipment, if you will, right? If you've ever been to an REI or any of those sporting goods stores, I'm sure you've seen hours and hours of hiking equipment. And the question kind of comes along, do I need all of this equipment to go on a hike? Maybe. Will this equipment help my hike be easier and help me enjoy it more? Probably. If I don't have any of this equipment, will I still be able to go on a hike? Who knows? And so we can say that while having a strong mentoring relationship definitely does support students, and our findings from the SNA echo that. That doesn't mean students who don't have that relationship are out of luck, if you will. So next I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Chris Peck, and he's going to talk a little bit more about the supports throughout the students' transitions.
Great. Thank you, Mark. So as you mentioned, I wanted to, we wanted to understand what Bridge programs, with Bridge program and supports were most critical in helping students transition into STEM PhD programs after the Bridge program had concluded, as well as transition into their post-PhD careers. To answer this question, we relied on data from interviews with current PhD students, as well as post-PhD Bridge program alumni. So first, I'll talk about Bridge supports for students transitioning into STEM PhD programs. More than half of the PhD students and alumni respondents that we spoke with shared that taking academic courses and doing research at Vanderbilt while they were Bridge students helped acclimate them to an elite graduate school environment, which further helped them understand the expectations of graduate level coursework, build self-confidence, and mitigate culture shock of a PWI elite university environment. So in particular, early exposure to the rigors and expectations of Vanderbilt's academic courses helped Bridge students cultivate an identity as graduate students, and it gave them an opportunity to sort of measure their abilities in comparison with other graduate students. An early chance to measure themselves in these ways helped to instill confidence and self-belief that they could handle the workload of an elite STEM PhD program, and that they were in fact on par with their peers. So that level of self-confidence was cited as really important facet of their success in a STEM PhD program. Just as importantly, respondents, particularly those who identified as racial or ethnic minorities, shared how important it was for them to experience the culture and climate of Vanderbilt's academic settings and learn how to effectively handle difficult experiences of marginalization and microaggressions early in their graduate careers. So this quote here, this is a program alumni describing the Bridge program as helping her to be seasoned a little bit before fully enrolling in a PhD program. She also references her experience as a woman of color who had to deal with things that she felt that other peers in her PhD program did not have to deal with. We can move to the next slide, thanks. Just under half of PhD students and alumni respondents referenced the mentorship and guidance they received. So Mark spoke a little bit about that mentorship from their research advisors while they were Bridge students as key supports. The relationship they established with these advisors, typically through working with them in research labs, naturally evolved into a PhD advisor role once Bridge students made that transition into Vanderbilt's PhD programs. So the mentorship was important, but I just wanted to stress that it was the continuity of these research relationships that they began while they were Bridge students. It's that continuity of that research/mentorship relationship that proved to be vital as they found their footing in the PhD program. Similarly, respondents shared that they have continued to draw on their relationships with their fellow cohort members, program staff, and Bridge program alumni in their academic tracks for social, mental, emotional support, as well as for academic and professional networking opportunities as they navigated the ins and outs of their PhD program experiences. So a few respondents here in the quote that you can see, they talked about, they invoked the word family to refer to this core supportive community. So just because they had made the transition didn't mean that their sense of family, their sense of kinship, their sense of support from the Bridge community stopped once they make the transition. They cited it as a continuing source of support. Just under half of the respondents shared that the research and professional skills that they developed when they were Bridge master students helped them successfully transition into STEM PhD programs. In particular, Bridge students gained key technical research skills in the lab work, such as working with instruments, taking measurements, building computational models, things like this, skills that formed a sort of strong technical foundation as they started their PhD programs. But in addition to these quote unquote hard research skills, respondents also talked about some of the soft skills, such as like attending seminars and workshops on skills related to presenting research, reading academic papers, managing their time, building CVs, resumes. All of those seminars on building these kinds of skills were cited as critical as they prepared for their PhD program. Next, I want to talk briefly about the gaps or the challenges that PhD students and alumni experienced in their transition to PhD programs. And I really want to stress here that the overwhelming majority of respondents felt prepared by the Bridge program for the rigors of their respective STEM PhD programs. So the gaps I'm talking about here are considered more minor issues that weren't necessarily deal breakers in terms of how prepared they felt for the transition. But nevertheless, we wanted to kind of highlight some of the things that came up as some gaps in their preparation. So first, while Bridge students who transitioned into the PhD or into Vanderbilt's PhD enjoyed strong program support, in particular the academic research and social networks that they formed as master students, some of the PhD students who chose to pursue their PhDs at non-Vanderbilt institutions, because you don't have to necessarily cross the bridge to Vanderbilt. You can go take your STEM PhD in other institutions. So those that went to other institutions that were not Vanderbilt, they perceived the difference between the more direct transition supports that their peers received, the ones that went to Vanderbilt, and what program administrators were able to do for them. So this respondent who chose to do his or her PhD at a non-Vanderbilt institution talked about the feeling of, quote, missing out on key supports when they transition to a non-Vanderbilt STEM PhD. While the majority of respondents felt that the bridge program had helped acclimate them, oh, I think it's the next slide, Robert, thanks. While the majority of respondents felt that the bridge program helped acclimate them to the culture of an elite graduate school environment and PWI, a few respondents still shared that they still struggled with culture shock and a feeling like they did not fully belong when they started their PhD programs. So this PhD student, for example, shared some of their painful experiences and the, quote, pretty ugly things that was said to them to make them feel like their training and expertise were somehow inadequate and that they did not belong. And a number of them talked about how even with the acclimation that they received as through the master's program, they just weren't prepared for that kind of environment. So one possible takeaway from this finding is that acclimation, while important, may not fully be enough to address some of the social and cultural challenges that bridge students face when they enter STEM PhD programs at elite or PWI institutions. Next, I want to talk a little bit about our findings related to bridge program supports that helped alumni transition into their post-PhD career. So this is after they had completed their PhDs, whether it's in postdocs or STEM careers that they found after their PhD. First, nearly all alumni discussed how they benefited from their access to the networking opportunities that came from being part of the bridge community. These networks include fellow bridge and PhD students, professors, and professionals that were already working in the field. So in particular, bridge alumni shared how they benefited from meeting a range of professionals in various fields and career stages, which gave them a sense of what was possible for their own careers. So just getting an understanding of what was out there, what different type of work folks were doing in their careers was really helpful for them while they were bridge students. It kind of gave them shape and kind of direction on what was possible. This alumni respondent talked about the importance of knowing what they needed to move forward and succeed. For some, bridge networks provided more direct benefits, such as research partnerships that have continued on throughout their careers, or connections, direct connections that have led to actual jobs. So for example, this alumni was able to find their postdoc program through a relationship they had already formed through the bridge program. And finally, a couple alumni described how their experiences in the bridge program cultivated a lifelong appreciation and commitment to the values behind the program. Values we've spoken about at length today include such things as like valuing diversity or identifying and supporting the, quote, diamond in the rough. For these alumni, a commitment to these values actually informed their career choices. So for example, this alumni referenced the bridge program's values around expanding opportunities to students who need support as informing their own choice to do a postdoc in the Center for Science Outreach, where they're able to work directly with students to support their own journeys. I think I remember another respondent talking about how their interest in neurodiversity came from their experiences, understanding the importance of diversity within the bridge program itself. So I found that to be an interesting connection. So yeah, those are the supports, the bridge supports that have kind of supported alumni and PhD students in making their transitions. And I think I hand it over to you, right, Robert?
Yep. Chris and Mark, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. So with that, those are our findings from the Fisk-Vanderbilt Bridge Program evaluation we've been doing the last couple of years. I also I had forgotten to thank one of our newest colleagues, Alberto Guzman Alvarez, for his work on the project. So I wanted to be sure to say, Alberto, thank you as well for everything you've done on this project. And with that, we'd like to open it up to questions and discussion. Feel free to ask any questions to any of us about the program and our findings. And if there's a question addressed to an individual person, if you could turn your video on for that, that'd be great.
So I'll go. So I have two questions, but I'll start with just one and then let others jump in, but then ask the second question later. So they're related. But so first question is about the quantitative analyses. And Robert, you got at this a little bit with the Tennessee matching study. But I guess just the overall question is, for the benchmark comparisons, how confident do you think you are in terms of accounting for potential self-selection and differences in the institution that students, in the bridge program versus those in the benchmark? How well do you feel you've accounted for that and can attribute the findings to the program specifically?
That's a great question. I'm happy to answer that, or if you wanted to do your second one, and then we could answer them both in sequence, whatever you prefer.
Sure. Yeah. So then the second one is that if we do think that there is, as big of a impact as what the quantitative analyses suggest, thinking about unpacking what that means in terms of what's the comparison intervention. And specifically, I'm thinking that probably in a lot of master's programs, they are fairly course-based and not providing a whole lot of scaffolding in the research. It's kind of more like an extension of undergrad than it is really an introduction to grad school. And so if that's the case, if that's kind of our benchmark comparison, I wonder if that kind of nature of what a standards master's program is contributes to the intervention comparison differences that we're seeing.
Those are great questions. So we'll take them, I guess, the first one first. And Eben, please also jump in with any additional thoughts or any other member of the team. So the first one about the matching study and the benchmarks. So we showed the earning the master's numbers and the earning the PhD numbers for those that have been in the PhD for long enough versus both national STEM numbers and Tennessee. The national STEM numbers are, some of them are a little bit dated, 2010, 2013, I believe, are the reference, maybe 2008. We tried to find more update national STEM numbers, but we haven't been able to find anything that's been publicly put out there. So we know those numbers are a little bit dated, but even if they were up to date, I'm gonna expect them to jump 20 percentage points. And the Fisk-Vanderbilt numbers are what they are. I mean, they're just incredibly high. The numbers are high. So we were trying to get at, well, let's look at the national numbers. It's much higher than national numbers, even if those are a little bit dated. Now let's look at Tennessee, which allows us to look at the same time period in the same kind of state context, same cohorts, but they are different institutions, and there are a lot of variation in institutions. And Vanderbilt is a predominantly white institution, which is a highly resourced institution, but Fisk is not. Fisk is a historically Black college and university, and traditionally HBCUs are under-resourced. And there's they're just traditionally under-resourced. So Fisk is not a predominantly well-resourced institution where you would expect to necessarily have incredibly high graduation numbers because of the supports that are thrown at students outside of the classroom. And the master's program is taking place at Fisk, and there are courses that they can take over at Vanderbilt, but they're getting their master's from that institution. So I feel fairly confident, not in the exact number, but I just feel very confident that the program is having a big influence on these graduation numbers because the raw descriptive numbers are incredibly high. The national numbers are pretty low. When we look at same sets of students in institutions in Tennessee trying to match, and we know matching is not perfect, it's not an experimental design, It can't remove unobserved selectivity issues. We can't minimize that. But when we look at Tennessee as well, we still see really high numbers. And the descriptive odds ratio is 10. So that's not even doing with the match group without putting it into any sort of analysis framework. The odds ratio is really high. And we tried using propensity score matching. We tried with some advice through Alberto, course and exact matching. And so we tried different methods and different samples, and the results still hold that this program is doing really particularly well. And so we think there's something about the program that is doing a really good job, and we don't think it's selectivity of the individuals that are coming to campus. We don't think it's you're taking a student who's going to be successful anywhere. There's no evidence of cream skimming. So when we talked about, there's no evidence that Fisk-Vanderbilt program is drawing students that look best on paper, either by saying, oh, they went to this really prestigious undergraduate institution, or they had a really high GPA. There's no evidence that they're just picking the most selective individuals, which is critically important, because if you're just fighting over the same individual, you're doing nothing to expand the pipeline whatsoever. You're just fighting over an individual who would be getting into a program anyway. So I don't think there's any selection with the students, and the results, no matter how we slice it and no matter how we look at it, they're really strong. And so I can't say there's a causal empirical effect, because we don't have an identification strategy to do the impact. They weren't randomly assigned. But no matter how we look at it, we can't argue away or statistically get away from this really big impact. So I think that answers your first question about, we're fairly confident that there's something specific to this program, but I wouldn't interpret the exact magnitude necessarily. And then, so Evan, let me pause on that before we get to the second one.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in. I mean, I agree that I don't think, like, we don't have a precise estimate that we think is the number that this is the impact of this program, which is why we just report the raw proportions of graduation rates, right? Like, and you know, it's I think that's to maybe move this also into Emma's question. Part of this, I think, project was working with, because this is a common criticism of these types of analyses for these types of programs, right? It's like they're super selective, and like, yeah, you can get this tiny little group, but what's the scalability of this if you have a small selected group and you're putting a lot of resources into it? So I think part of our work here, working with Fisk-Vanderbilt, was thinking about ways that you can collect data to sort of get more at that causal impact. So and Emma's question there about, you know, applicants, right, the intent to treat sample, maybe like the students who applied to this program didn't get in, and then following them out, you know, 5-10 years to see what their outcomes look like might be a better close estimate to similar students who did or did not get into the program. And so that sort of addresses that question, and also talks about, I think, what your second question was, which is, right, what is this comparison group receiving, right? And yeah, I mean, I haven't thought a lot about that. I think it's an interesting question. But I mean, I do think that one of, and the qualitative folks can weigh in on this. I think that one of the things we've heard is that an important part of this program also is a relationship between faculty. And so drawing those connections between master's faculty and PhD faculty can help students sort of develop the skills that they'll be more likely to need in a PhD program. So I think it is a very different type of master's experience that they're getting as well.
Yeah, and I think, Evan, just to like, I was going to maybe bring this up before too, like that has been just in interviews in conversations with the Fisk-Vanderbilt team, including Arnold Berger, who's on the Fisk side and was one of the founders of the program. Like, he has emphasized when we've spoken with him just how critical that history and relationship between Fisk and Vanderbilt is. And that's not to say that there aren't like challenging times between the institutions and this program and getting like financial support for it. But in terms of the faculty relationships, he really stresses that a critical part of this is for the students and for success of the program in terms of faculty is the joint research relationship that comes out of this, and those faculty relationships, including the mentoring and exposure that the master's students get to Vanderbilt faculty, and their labs and what the expectations are, and then also just that the faculty have those connections as well. So that's, I'm not really getting at so much the quantitative side, but there aren't that many bridges, just as additional context. There are not very many bridge programs right now out there that that are between two institutions. So many of the other ones, or especially between a minority serving institution and a PWI. So many of the other ones that are out there that have modeled themselves after this, including the APS has a bridge program, the American Physics Society has a bridge program that they have heavily modeled after, and have some institutions they've heavily modeled after the Fisk-Vanderbilt program. But many of those are actually like within university bridges. So like Ohio State, for example, like students get admitted and then they bridge over into like a kind of master's or intern or kind of temporary doctor students. And then after 2 years, they get like officially, if they meet a certain standard, get like they continue on with the doctorate. But in any event, it is a unique program in that regard. I also just wanted to say something about the, this gets a little bit at like how we worked with Fisk-Vanderbilt, and something that I think, Robert, you said in terms of helping, or maybe it was Evan, in terms of a key part of this project was helping the bridge program itself sort of understand and build a data like understand what kind of data need to be collected, how systematically, how to collect that, and help them build a platform for doing so. And that was one of the key goals of the project, or the collaboration with them, is that they really recognized a need, and have for many years, to say like institutions do not collect the right data or do it in a very systematic way. So like when we first started working with them to put the data that they had on their students, they had Word files, they had Excel files, they had multiple things on their students, and they just did not have like a one place to go and actually like run, or the tools or the capacity to run these analyses or report some of like their key like outcomes and the progress that students were making. So we helped them build that, and that was a key goal, and something that they want to kind of share out as a model for other institutions and other programs. So we were a little bit limited in the data because we were trying to like figure out what was actually available, and we didn't collect, other than the survey data, a lot of new information during our project period. But I'm kind of rambling a bit, but in that regard, I guess also to get a little bit at Kelly's question, and then I'd be curious to see what my colleague said in terms of what was like most surprising to the team. I think these impacts were super surprising to them, even though they've like kind of observed the successes of their students, but they had not had the tools or the methods to be able to run these analyses themselves. So seeing those numbers, when like the last time they actually like ran some numbers, and it was way more descriptive and limited, was like back in, I don't know, I think like their last publication was in 2014. So it's been years since they've been able to really understand or try to assess to some degree the impact that they're having and the success of their program compared to national or state numbers. Okay, and I'll pause there.
Thanks, Evan, and thanks, Courtney. And David, we really appreciate the questions and all the questions in the chat. I think we've addressed some of them, but and I wanted to say something else to respond to David, but Abby, if there's any others that we've missed or that we could elaborate on, just let me know in a moment. What I wanted to add was that we know these types of programs are hard. And this one is one of the oldest, most well-established, most well-known ones that has been really quite successful. And there's some that are trying to get up off the ground. But it takes a lot of effort, consistency, and staff to do this, and to have institutional support, and also outside funding often is very, very helpful for these programs. But they're small. Courtney, do you remember the cohort sizes on average for these? I think this year they had maybe about 10 students, or maybe Evan, you remember, but they're small.
Yeah.
And so
And
this
that's
is,
across fields.
yeah,
So
that's
like
right.
total, I think it's like they try to get like 9 to 12, maybe closer to 12. But they once had, I know there was one year where they had 19, and the program really fell apart. And they learned some important lessons that like the students were not as connected, not as engaged, not as satisfied, and they really struggled. They also, on that note, too, tried to expand to engineering based on engineering's interest in it. And they found out, I think it was like after a year of implementation with engineering, that the engineering program just did not buy into the philosophy entirely. And so they ended up not working with engineering and eliminating that part of the bridge because they were just like, it's not a good fit. It's not true to our model or how we engage with students or consider them and work with them. And so they are very, very selective as well in terms of ensuring that they are bringing students into a culture and environment that is committed to the intent of the program and the philosophy guiding it.
Yeah. And one of the things I wanted to add was that with these small sample sizes, with these small cohorts of students, I should say, there can be more individual attention, but as Courtney mentioned, it fell apart when they had to handle 19 people. And so we know that this program is very successful, but it's not scalable on its own. So it's part of a broader conversation about what could something more scalable look like. And David, I think to your second question about the comparison intervention, or like the graduate school as usual, graduate schooling as usual, perhaps. What does that look like? And so if the default is these students and there's very few supports, I think one of the conversations could be broadly for STEM programming or master's programming in general across the country, just broader supports for students, all students. And so this program is certainly doing that. And that's one of its aspects. But the other is also to specifically diversify the STEM pipeline by bringing in underrepresented groups, broadly defined, into the program. And so it's providing these supports and being successful. And so it might be unpacking a conversation about supports for students and individual, and supports and programmatic efforts to help diversify the STEM pipeline. And to move the needle on that.
Yeah, and to build on that, Robert, like recent conversations that we've had in terms of like sort of as we report out these findings and more publicly, like through peer-reviewed journals and manuscripts, like I mean, the program itself, and we've had these just recently had these conversations with the Bridge program, it's like they recognize too that these interventions, they're just not going to be scalable in ways that actually like on their own and without like institutional support, and actually just like institutional and system-wide change. Like they recognize that what they are doing and what they call themselves doing is, they're creating a counter space to really problematic practices, policies, and structures that are the norm in graduate STEM education and probably graduate school, writ large to a certain extent. And what they are doing and what they believe they are doing is best for all students. This isn't, so they are operating on a small scale because that's what they have funding and the ability to do. And, but in full recognition that, this model is not, it's not scalable on its own. It needs to be, it requires, if for something to really change and not just have these sorts of like supplemental or tacked on diversity programs, there needs to be not just sort of like a vocal commitment to diversity, but not any sort of like real systemic like change and action beyond just throwing money at these programs, which, as they've said, they've been around for, since 2004, and they continue to be challenged and have to struggle and fight for funding from Vanderbilt, as well as just go after proposal to get some grant funding to support them. So, their successes get kind of paraded around, but not with any real investment or change behind them, if that makes sense. So there is that kind of just issue with scaling any kind of program like this. Yeah.
Great. So maybe we answered these a little bit. I've been looking through the chat. And so Emma, about data and looking at people who didn't enroll in the program, people that finished the master's but didn't do a PhD. It's hard to have that information because it wasn't tracked. I think Evan said that. And so we don't know, for instance, those that were granted an interview and that were given a placement but that didn't accept. We don't know information on those groups, for instance. So these sorts of programs, if they're interested in examining in a rigorous manner, have to build in design from the very beginning to collect this information. And so that's certainly a challenge. And so Jen, I think that speaks to your question as well about what challenges we faced and overcame. On the quantitative side, I could speak to is trying to identify a good comparison group, given that there wasn't a experimental design, quasi-experimental design in these types of programs, and getting accurate information to be able to speak to these findings. So we were lucky that the numbers are so large that no matter how we slice it, the findings stand out on their own descriptively. And so that's a nice thing to be able to show to our partners at Fisk-Vanderbilt. Evan?
Yeah, I was just going to also, in addition to that, the survey data. So social network analysis was sort of an idea we came up with together with the group based on some of the things that we were seeing might be important coming out of the qualitative data. And so that process of co-developing measures and coming up with what kind of constructs we wanted to measure, and then so not just how to measure, but what to measure also was a collaborative conversation with the client. And I think important, like this was all the social network analysis was done just in the spring. So it was all cross-sectional, but it'd be really interesting if we start to see, if we start to collect those types of data longitudinally, if this program continually collects this, and then we can start to see how sense of belonging and some of these networks start to form over time as they move through the program. So that's another piece of like the capacity building for some of these programs, is thinking about what to measure and how to measure it in such a way that you can start to measure trends, and which again gets a little bit closer to not an experimental design, but a better causal inference about the impacts of the program and the pieces that are sort of moving the needle for these students.
Okay. I think we've answered all the questions. If I've missed one, I apologize, and please, let us know, speak up. We're happy to answer the questions.
I think there was just one, Robert, that maybe we can speak. I know we've kind of like probably indirectly spoken to this a little bit, but Jen had a question around just working with the Fisk-Vanderbilt team and kind of what that looked like. And so I had thrown in the comment or in the chat that it was, a very collaborative approach. So we really did, and I think that benefited our project a lot. We shared, all of our qualitative interview protocols with them ahead of time to make sure we were using language that made sense to the folks that we would be interviewing, that we were actually getting at questions that they truly were interested in terms of both continuous improvement and sharing back out with the field. So we had at least quarterly check-ins, but basically like anytime we sort of iterated on something, we got their feedback. And I think it was super helpful to better understand the intents of the program, what's driving it, where they had gaps in knowledge, and what they were sort of like either some assumptions that they had or things that they just didn't know enough about. And that was particularly helpful when it came to like the solution network analysis survey that Evan led, as well as working with them around their, like even just setting up the data platform and understanding what data were most useful for them. Because one thing that they said too, they needed was just like, they knew what their reporting, like grant funding reporting requirements are. And they're like, these are the things we need to be able to report on, as well as just collecting like additional information that internally, even if they don't report on it, would be super helpful for them to have about the students, just to continue to kind of track their progress to the program, as well as just things as simple as like, and like their status. So like, were they in good standing with the program right now based on like where they were they in sort of medium standing or at risk? And so I don't know if that really helps answer. I would say, and there were also times where they provided, and I think this is before Robert and Evan came on, where, after the first year, they had some concerns actually about like, we're not quite getting there with certain things of the work, like pieces of the work that we thought AR was doing. And there was sort of like this And I'm so glad they reached out, but I think part of our collaboration together too was kind of making sure that we were checking in, that we were on the same page, and that we were both sort of like supporting each other in the work in ways that were within our scope of work and also meeting the expectations of the grant. So there was a point where there was a little bit too much silence between us in that first year, and we really learned a key lesson about like making sure we were checking in to say like, are we all on the same page in terms of what we're doing and the goals of like a specific task or data collection effort. I don't know if others would add anything based on their communications around specific tasks with the team, but I think it was really beneficial for this project in particular. Go ahead, Jen. Looks like you just
Yeah, please.
Oh no, I was just gonna say that's helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Jen. And thanks, Courtney. And Emma put another question in the chat. And maybe some of us who did the qualitative work, particularly if you interviewed any of the faculty, maybe you would recall. So Emma asked, do we have a sense of how the program impacted Fisk faculty in terms of their own research or their pedagogical techniques or ways they might have benefited from participating? And so if anyone recalls if there was anything relevant to that came up in the interviews we did with the faculty.
That is a good question. I should let Mark, like others who did some interviews, weigh in. I would say our protocols did not get at this. So we were much more focused, and the focus of the project was more on like student experiences and their engagement with Bridge students in terms of how they mentored them, the approach they took to mentoring them, the roles they played in like on admissions and that kind of thing. So we didn't ask so much about the benefits of faculty because that's a secondary, like not the core goal of the program. So I think it's a super interesting question. And I think probably some spoke to that to some degree, but Chris, Mark, who's still on the?
Yeah, I'm on. That's a great question. And yeah, I agree with you, Courtney, that it's not a primary line of inquiry. I mean, the only thing I can think of is from our interviews with the faculty is that a lot of them spoke, we had questions that kind of try to probe their understanding of the core philosophy of the program. And if my memory serves me correctly, a lot of them were able to kind of connect this idea of, you know, and this is both not just Fisk, but Vanderbilt as well, like kind of understanding the value of this program, like, you know, identifying students that need that extra main, like, you know, the ones that are that quote unquote diamond in the rough, the ones that that are, you know, would benefit a lot from being given opportunities in a program like Bridge. And then I know a lot of faculty were just talking about, you know, talking more on, you know, not so much as, you know, like a professor or anything like this, or as a teacher even, but just talking on a more human level about what this program means. You can see that they understood their position within that value set. And I have to imagine, I mean, it's not, you know, directly answering the question, but I have to imagine that that kind of core understanding of their sort of more missional perspective in this sense would affect maybe their pedagogical, if not their willingness to be more of a mentor, more of a support as faculty. I'm not sure if that really addresses the question, but that's the first thing that comes to mind.
Yeah, I think they did talk about, I agree, Chris. I think it was more conversations around, if anything, how they benefited just from the interactions with students and playing a role in the program and being involved. I think on the Vanderbilt side, but I did a previous study that included this site. So I can't remember if it's from the prior study. It was similar in focus, but, or this one where it came out, but I would say the Vanderbilt faculty in particular, there were some that, you know, just talked about how it introduced them to students that, you know, that they know would have otherwise been kind of overlooked or not met the standard for graduate schools. And in terms of just sort of being kind of understanding and recognizing and valuing the different sort of skill sets that students bring into their labs and how successful they can be, even if they don't meet or satisfy kind of the traditional metrics. So I think opening up some of those sort of mindsets to like, we should be looking at people not just by like GRE or GPA, for example, but more on some of these like non-cognitive factors, because they had seen such high successes and had such good interactions and experiences with students in the Bridge program.
Abby, do you want to elaborate on that point?
Yeah. So I did a lot of the qualitative analysis on the admissions sections of our interviews with Bridge folks. So that includes like faculty as well as the administrators and things. But I remember coming across a couple of different examples in which faculty talked about how they change their perspective on their approach to the admissions process, because the Bridge program is much more holistic in its approach to admissions than traditional graduate programs. And so just speaking to kind of or comparing their experiences and having to like shift their mindset or shift their focus when looking at the admissions for, say, some other department that they were in or some other track, compared to how they approach the Bridge program, and just, I don't know, like calling out those differences in terms of like, I think Courtney touched on this, like not looking at GRE scores, like just generally taking a whole different, more holistic, more accepting, I would say, perspective and approach to how they assessed Bridge student applicants versus other applicants from other departments and their experiences in those other departments, and what those departments prioritized in their admissions processes compared to the Bridge program.
Well, thank you, Abby. Thank you, Courtney. Thanks everyone for the questions. I know we're at time. If there are other questions, please let us know. We will be making the slides available to everybody and the recording as well. So if there's nothing else, we just want to say thank you very much for your time. We very much appreciate all the feedback, all your thoughts, and your attention today. And feel free to reach out to us. I've listed my contact information, but you can reach out to any of us, and we'd be more than happy to discuss further. We really enjoyed working on this program, and we're thrilled with what we've been able to do. So thanks very much.